The auction yard smelled of dust and old leather, the kind of place where dreams either found wings or shattered like brittle glass. The sun hung low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, but for the man standing at the edge of the bidding pit, the colors barely registered. His world had already dimmed long ago. He had once been proud, once built something with his hands, sweat, and soil making up the foundation of his life. But seasons of hardship had stolen everything. Crops failed, debts piled up, and one by one, the things he loved slipped through his fingers like sand in the wind. Now, with nothing left to lose, he was here, watching men wave their paddles, bidding on animals worth more than the land he was about to lose. He hadn't come to buy. He barely had enough left to feed himself, let alone an animal. But something about this auction called to him a pull he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the whisper of hope, the kind that lingers even when you tell yourself it's gone. Or maybe he just wanted to see something win for once, even if it wasn't him. Then the stallion was brought out. The murmurs in the crowd turned into laughter, scoffs. The animal was a mess. Ribs pressed against its ragged coat, a deep scar ran along its hind leg, and the way it stood head low, ears back, made it clear it had already lost whatever fight it once had. "A waste of money," someone muttered. "Can't even stand right," another laughed. The auctioneer tried to drum up interest, but there was none. The numbers thrown out were barely worth mentioning, a few half-hearted bids from men who only saw the stallion as a problem to be offloaded. The price dropped lower, then lower still. And then, without thinking, he raised his hand. Silence. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. Did he really just bid on that thing? The gavel slammed down. Sold. A ripple of disbelief ran through the crowd, followed by shrugs. It wasn't their problem. But for him, standing there as reality settled in, it suddenly was. He had just spent his last dollars on a broken horse. Why? He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was because he saw himself and the animal defeated, cast aside, laughed at. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be forgotten. Or maybe, just maybe, a tiny part of him refused to believe that anything or anyone was beyond saving. The stallion didn't fight when he approached, didn't react much at all. It only flicked an ear, staring at him with dull, tired eyes. "This was a mistake," he muttered under his breath. But it was done. The papers were signed. The last of his money was gone. All he could do now was take the stallion home, if you could call it that. His farm, what was left of it, was barely standing. The barn leaned to one side. The fences had gaps big enough to walk through, and the house itself, well, he didn't spend much time inside anymore. It was too quiet, too empty. Leading the stallion into the paddock, he expected it to collapse, to give up like the rest of the world had. Instead, something strange happened. The moment its hooves touched the dry earth, a shiver ran through its frame. Its ears perked, its head lifted slightly, and for the first time, there was something in its eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition. The stallion took a slow step forward, then another. It sniffed the air as if searching for something long lost. And then, in a sudden burst of energy, it let out a deep, guttural sound, a sound that sent a chill down his spine. Because for the first time in a long, long while, it didn't look broken anymore. It looked like it remembered something. Something important. Something dangerous. The wind picked up, sweeping through the broken fence posts and rattling the tin roof of the barn. The stallion stood there, its head high, muscles tense beneath its rough coat. It wasn't the same defeated creature that had stumbled onto the auction block. No, something had changed the moment it touched this land, something he couldn't explain. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching. The horse wasn't eating, wasn't resting, just standing there, staring out at the horizon like it was waiting for something. It made no sense. Animals didn't act like that. Not ones that had been beaten down by life, not ones that had given up. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe he just wanted to see something in the stallion that wasn't there. Still, the unease lingered. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath. What the hell did I just buy? The stallion didn't react, didn't even twitch an ear in his direction. With a shake of his head, he pushed away from the fence and made his way toward the house. There wasn't much left in the pantry, just a few cans and a half-empty bag of rice. He scraped together a meal, eating in silence, listening to the creaks and groans of a house that had once been full of life. Memories threatened to surface, voices that weren't there anymore, laughter that had faded like echoes in an empty room. He shoved them down, forced himself to focus on the present. Outside, the stallion let out another sound. Low. Almost like a warning. He set his fork down, glancing toward the window. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the land in deep blues and grays. The horse was still in the same spot, still staring out at something unseen. A chill crept up his spine. He wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but right now, standing in that too-quiet house with that horse acting like it knew something he didn't, he wasn't so sure. The night passed in restless sleep. Dreams came in flashes, shadows moving through the fields, whispers carried on the wind. He woke up more than once, heart pounding, but every time he looked outside, the stallion was there, unmoving, watching. By morning, exhaustion pressed heavy on his bones. He stepped outside, rubbing a hand over his face, half expecting to see the horse collapsed from hunger or fatigue. Instead, it stood tall, its coat glistening with morning dew, its dark eyes locked onto him the second he stepped off the porch. A test. That's what it felt like. He grabbed a bucket and filled it with feed, carrying it over. The stallion didn't move. Didn't even flinch when he set the bucket down in front of it. Most starving animals would have torn into the food, desperate for anything to fill their stomachs. This one didn't. It just looked at him. He frowned, crouching beside the bucket, running his hand through the grain. "Go on," he muttered. "Eat." Nothing. Minutes passed, the air thick with something unspoken. Then, just when he was about to stand, the stallion stepped forward. Not toward the food, but toward him. A slow, deliberate step. The scarred muzzle lowered, nostrils flaring as if taking in his scent. His pulse kicked up, muscles tensing on instinct. Another step. The stallion was close now, close enough that he could see the fine details of its eyes, the way they weren't just dark, but layered, deep, like something ancient lived behind them. Then, in one sudden motion, the stallion swung its head and shoved him backward. He hit the dirt hard, breath rushing out of his lungs. Before he could even react, the stallion let out a sharp, powerful sound, not a whinny, not a snort, but something deeper, something that sent birds scattering from the trees. A sound that didn't belong to a creature that had given up. He sat up, heart hammering, staring up at the horse looming over him. It wasn't afraid, wasn't broken. And for the first time since he bought it, he realized something unsettling. It had never been. It had only been waiting. For what? He didn't know. But whatever it was, the stallion's breath was slow, controlled, misting in the cool morning air. It stood over him, eyes steady, watching. Not with fear, not with anger, but with something else, something that sent an uneasy shiver down his spine. He pushed himself up, brushing dirt from his hands, muscles tense. Most horses spooked easily, especially ones that had been through what this one had. But this stallion, it wasn't afraid of him. If anything, it had been studying him, testing him. He'd seen a lot of broken animals in his life. He knew the look of a creature that had lost its fight, the way their eyes dulled, the way their bodies sagged with defeat. He had mistaken this horse for one of them. But now, standing there, heart still racing, he knew the truth. This animal had never lost its fight. It had only been hiding it. The air between them felt heavier than before, thick with something he didn't understand. He should have walked away, should have shaken off the feeling creeping up his spine. But he didn't. He reached for the lead rope hanging from the fence post, moving slow, deliberate. The stallion watched but didn't back away. "All right," he muttered, voice low. "Let's see what you're made of." The rope slipped over the horse's head easily. Too easily. He expected resistance, some flicker of hesitation, but there was none. The stallion let him take control without a single fight. It should have been a relief, but it only made him more uneasy. He led the horse toward the barn, watching every step, waiting for some sign of weakness. But there was none. The limp he had noticed at the auction was gone. The hesitation, the fatigue gone. The stallion moved like a shadow, each step smooth. His boots crunched against the dirt floor as they stepped inside. The barn smelled of old hay and damp wood, a place that had once held life but now only echoed with silence. He tied the lead to a post, stepping back, watching. The stallion stood still, eyes unreadable. He grabbed a brush, running it down the animal's back, searching for scars, for injuries, for any sign that this horse had been mistreated or starved as badly as it looked. But under the rough, matted coat, the muscles were strong, built for speed and power. The more he looked, the more something felt wrong. This horse hadn't been neglected. It had been hidden. The thought hit him like a hammer to the chest. Someone had let this stallion waste away on purpose. Someone had wanted it to look weak, unwanted. But why? He exhaled slowly, setting the brush aside. His hands moved to the stallion's mane, untangling knots as his mind spun. Maybe it was stolen. Maybe it had belonged to someone who didn't want it to be found. Or maybe his fingers brushed against something. Metal. Cold. Buried deep beneath the thick hair of its mane. His pulse jumped. He parted the strands carefully, revealing a small, circular object pressed against the horse's skin. A brand? No. A tag. Something small, something he had never seen on a horse before. It wasn't just a simple marker. It was deliberate. Hidden. His stomach tightened. This stallion wasn't just another unwanted animal. It had a past. A purpose. And someone, somewhere, had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. Before he could think, the stallion shifted, muscles tightening beneath his hands. The air in the barn grew still. Heavy. The kind of silence that warned of something unseen, something watching. He turned slowly, glancing toward the open barn door. And then, a shadow moved just beyond the fence line. Someone was out there. Watching. Waiting. For what? He didn't know. But whatever this was, whatever he had just uncovered, his breath came slow and steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. The shadow outside the fence wasn't moving anymore, just lingering, watching. The early morning light hadn't touched that part of the land yet. The feeling prickled against the back of his neck, the kind of instinct that had kept him alive through harder times. The stallion shifted, ears flicking toward the unseen figure. It knew, too. He didn't move, didn't call out, just waited. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. A flicker of movement, a shift in the wind, and the land was empty again. He swallowed hard. Whoever it was, they hadn't come to steal. If they had, they wouldn't have just stood there. No, this was something else. Someone making sure the stallion was still here. Someone waiting for something. The thought tightened in his chest. He turned back to the horse, fingers brushing against the hidden tag again. It was smooth, almost flush against the skin, placed so carefully that no one would have noticed unless they were looking for it. This wasn't something from a standard ranch brand. It wasn't even something he had ever seen before. This horse wasn't just expensive. It was something more. Something someone wanted to disappear. And he had brought it home. The air inside the barn felt too still now, pressing in on him. He needed answers. He moved quickly, untying the lead and guiding the stallion back outside. The moment its hooves touched the earth again, it straightened, nostrils flaring, muscles tensing like it was listening to something he couldn't hear. He led it toward the small round pen near the field, testing its movement. The horse followed, steps smooth, powerful. No hesitation. Whatever limp it had shown at the auction had been a lie. That realization only made his stomach twist more. Someone had wanted to get rid of this stallion. Or at least wanted people to think it was useless. But why? He picked up a lunge line, giving the horse room to move. The stallion hesitated for only a moment before stepping into a trot. Then a canter. Then a burst of power. It moved like nothing he had ever seen before. Not just fast, controlled, calculated. Every step was deliberate, balanced, like it had been trained far beyond anything a simple farm horse would ever know. His fingers tightened around the rope. This wasn't just a horse. This was something else. The stallion rounded the pen once more, then suddenly stopped. Not from exhaustion, not from confusion. It stopped because it had heard something. His pulse jumped. Then he heard it too. A truck. Distant but coming fast, kicking up dust from the old road leading up to his property. His first instinct was to assume the worst. His second instinct told him that, for once, his first instinct was right. Whoever had been watching from the shadows wasn't alone. And now they were coming back. For the horse. For him. Maybe for both. He moved fast, unhooking the lunge line, gripping the stallion's halter tight. The truck was getting closer, the deep growl of an engine built for rough terrain. Not some lost traveler. Not a neighbor dropping by. Whoever they were coming for a reason. And something told him they weren't going to knock. The stallion shifted beside him, muscles flexing, ready. Not scared. Not unsure. Ready. As if it had been waiting for this moment all along. He just didn't know if that was a good thing or not. The truck crested the hill. And the moment he saw it, his blood ran cold. Because he recognized it. And that meant whoever was inside. They already knew who he was. And they weren't here to talk. The truck barreled down the road, tires spitting gravel, engine roaring like a predator closing in on its prey. He knew that truck. Knew the people who drove it. And he knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't a coincidence. His fingers clenched around the stallion's halter, heart slamming against his ribs. He didn't have a plan. Didn't even know what he was up against. But everything in him screamed that whatever was coming, it wasn't good. The stallion's ears pinned back, muscles coiling, nostrils flaring at the scent of the approaching vehicle. It wasn't afraid. It was preparing. The truck skidded to a stop just beyond the fence line. The dust cloud swirled around it, swallowing the land in a thick haze. Then, slowly, the driver's side door creaked open. A figure stepped out. Broad shoulders. Slow movements. Calculated. He hadn't seen that face in years. Had hoped he never would again. But there he was. And the look in his eyes said everything. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," the man said, voice rough, edged with something dark. His gut twisted. It wasn't the stallion he was talking about. Not just the stallion. The stallion let out a low, deep breath, shifting slightly. It was waiting, sensing the tension, reading the space between them like it had done this before. Like it knew this moment was coming. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady. "I bought this horse fair and square." The man took another step forward. "That's not what I meant." Something inside him went still. The wind rattled the barn doors. The land stretched wide and empty behind them, offering no help, no escape. His fingers tightened around the lead rope. His skin burned where the stallion's tag had pressed against his palm earlier. Something bigger was at play. And for the first time since bringing the stallion home, he realized he wasn't just caught in the middle. He was part of it. The man tilted his head, eyes sharp. "You really don't remember, do you?" The words sent a chill down his spine. "Remember what?" He opened his mouth to respond. But before he could, the stallion moved. Not in fear. Not in confusion. In purpose. And in that instant, he understood. This wasn't just a horse. This was a message. And someone had been waiting for him to receive it. The stallion lunged. Not in fear, not in confusion, but with purpose. Its hooves struck the dirt, muscles coiling, every movement precise, controlled. The man barely had time to react before the horse was between them, a barrier of raw power standing in his way. The man didn't flinch. He just watched. "Now it makes sense," he muttered, his voice low, almost amused. The words sent a cold shock through him. None of this made sense. Not the stallion, not the tag hidden in its mane, not the way this man had come looking for something beyond just the horse. "You really don't remember, do you?" the man asked again, taking another slow step forward. His hands tightened around the lead rope, mind racing. He had spent years trying to forget the past, the mistakes, the people he had left behind. But now, standing here, the pieces were shifting into place, whether he wanted them to or not. The stallion snorted, ears pinned, its stance unshaken. And then, memories hit like a thunderclap. A different field. A different time. He was younger, desperate, running from something he couldn't face. And there had been a horse just like this one. Trained, controlled, meant for something more than simple farm life. Meant for something dangerous. The tag. The auction. The way the stallion had been hidden in plain sight. This wasn't just a horse. It was his past, dragged back to the surface. The man smirked, eyes dark with knowing. "They've been waiting for you to figure it out. But I don't think you ever wanted to." The air felt thinner, the weight of something unseen pressing down. He took a step back, but the stallion didn't move. It stood its ground. Because it had never been waiting for just anyone. It had been waiting for him. The man exhaled as if the conversation had already played out in his mind. "You have a choice," he said simply. "You can walk away and pretend none of this ever happened. Or you can face it." A choice. Like he hadn't already made it years ago. Like fate hadn't just shoved it back into his hands. The wind picked up, rattling the barn doors, stirring the dust between them. The stallion remained still, waiting. The man watched, patient. He swallowed hard, because deep down, he already knew. There was no walking away from this. Not anymore. The stallion stood between them, its presence heavy, waiting. The man had given him a choice, but deep down, he knew there had never really been one. Some things, no matter how far you run, always find their way back. He let out a slow breath, loosening his grip on the lead rope. "Tell me," he said, voice steady, "what this is really about." The man studied him, as if deciding how much truth he was ready for. Then, finally, he nodded. "That horse isn't just any stallion. He was trained for something bigger, something off the books. When things went south, they tried to make him disappear, just like they did with you." The words settled like a stone in his chest. He had walked away from that life, from the decisions that had nearly cost him everything. But now, staring at the horse, he understood why it had been sent to him, why it had ended up at that auction, looking weak, discarded. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't luck. It was a message. The stallion had been waiting for him, just as much as the past had been. The man sighed, as if this was the part he had hoped to avoid. "They know you have him now, and they're not the kind to let things go." A chill crept up his spine. He had built this life to escape that world, to leave behind the choices that had nearly broken him. But the stallion had changed everything. He couldn't just ignore what he knew now. He turned to the horse, running a hand down its neck. It didn't flinch. It trusted him. Maybe it always had. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind through the trees. Then, finally, he looked back at the man. "If they come," he said, his voice firm, "they won't be the only ones ready." A small smile tugged at the man's lips. "I figured you'd say that." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his truck. The engine rumbled to life, and just like that, he was gone, leaving only dust in his wake. He stood there for a long time, watching the road, knowing this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something he thought he had left behind. But this time, he wasn't running. The stallion let out a slow breath, lowering its head beside him. He reached up, fingers brushing against the hidden tag one last time. Maybe fate had brought them back together. Maybe it had always been leading here. Either way, he wasn't turning away now. With one last glance at the empty road, he took the stallion's lead and walked toward the barn.